The moment Elena Morales felt the cold steel of the gun barrel press against her ribs behind her tamale stand, she knew the stories whispered among the vendors had finally arrived at her doorstep. The marketplace had changed overnight, transformed from a vibrant hub of laughter and commerce into a theater of fear where every merchant now performed their daily routine under the watchful eyes of young men whose bodies were canvases of blue ink and death. 3 of them stood before her now, their leader no older than 25, with teardrops tattooed beneath his left eye and a smile that held no warmth. The morning sun seemed to retreat behind the clouds as he spoke, his voice low and casual, as if discussing the weather rather than threatening her livelihood. Around them, other vendors suddenly became very interested in arranging their produce, their silence a protective shield they desperately hoped would make them invisible. The leader's demands were simple, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had made this speech dozens of times before at every stand along the market row. Every week, a percentage of her earnings would ensure her safety, her stand's protection, and most importantly, that her family would remain unharmed in their beds at night. His companions flanked him like shadows given human form, their eyes scanning the crowd for any hint of resistance, any foolish spark of defiance that would need to be extinguished. Eleanor's hands trembled as she wrapped another tamale, the corn husk crackling in the heavy silence that had fallen over her corner of the market. She thought of her small apartment, of the photographs lining the walls, of Sunday dinners and the sound of her sons' laughter echoing through rooms filled with love and the aroma of her cooking. But it was the leader's final words that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. The casual mention of her granddaughter's school, the specific cross streets where the yellow bus dropped children off every afternoon at 3 o'clock. He knew where she lived, where her family gathered, the intimate geography of her entire world mapped out in his threats. The other vendors had already paid, he explained, gesturing down the long rows of stands with a proprietorial sweep of his arm. She could see it in their faces as she looked around, the defeat that had settled into their shoulders like a permanent weight they would carry forever. The marketplace that had been her second home for 15 years had become occupied territory, and she was being given a choice that was no choice at all. Elena counted out the bills from her cash box with shaking fingers, watching her week's profit disappear into the leader's tattooed hands, while something ancient and fierce awakened in the deepest chambers of her heart. She had survived poverty, buried a husband, raised a son alone through years that tried to break her spirit, and built a life from nothing but determination and cornflour. These boys, these children playing at being monsters, had made a terrible miscalculation in choosing her as their victim. As they walked away, counting their extorted money and laughing among themselves, Elena began to memorize faces with the precision of someone preparing for war, not surrender. The following week arrived with the weight of inevitability, bringing the gang members back to Elena's stand like vultures returning to a familiar carcass. But this time, something fundamental had shifted in the molecular structure of the marketplace air, a change so subtle that only those who truly knew Elena could detect it in the set of her jaw and the steel behind her eyes. When the leader extended his hand expectantly, palm up like a king collecting tribute from conquered peasants, Elena continued arranging her tamales with deliberate slowness, each movement a statement of defiance that rippled through the watching crowd. The other vendors froze mid-transaction, sensing the approaching storm, their breaths caught in their throats as they witnessed what no one had dared attempt. Around them, the normal sounds of commerce died away, replaced by a silence so complete that even the distant traffic seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Elena finally looked up, meeting the gang leader's eyes, with a directness that made him unconsciously take half a step backward before catching himself. Her voice, when it came, carried across the marketplace with the clarity of a church bell cutting through morning fog, loud enough for every cowering vendor to hear her words and remember them forever. She told him about the dictatorship she had survived as a girl, when real soldiers with real authority had tried to break her family and failed spectacularly in their attempts. She spoke of the cartel wars she had witnessed in her 20s when her neighborhood ran red with blood, but she still walked to market every single day with her head held high. These boys with their stolen guns and borrowed swagger were playing dress-up in their father's clothes, she declared, and she would not surrender one more peso to their theatrical performance. The leader's face transformed from confusion to rage, the kind of volcanic anger that men display when their authority is challenged before an audience they've carefully cultivated through fear. His hand moved toward his waistband where the gun rested like a promise of violence, but Elena stood her ground, her weathered hands steady as mountains despite the electricity of danger crackling through the air. She told him that death had been her companion for 7 decades, sitting beside her at too many funerals and kitchen tables to count anymore. If he wanted to shoot an old woman over tamales, she continued, then he should do it now in front of everyone, and see how that enhanced his precious reputation in a community that still believed in honor. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances, their carefully constructed world of intimidation suddenly encountering an obstacle their playbook hadn't prepared them for in all their strategic planning. Miguel, the youngest among them, stared at Elena with something approaching wonder in his dark eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time what true courage looked like when stripped of weapons and posturing. The leader grabbed a stack of her tamales, hurling them to the ground where they burst open like small casualties of his bruised ego, before pointing at Elena with a trembling finger and promising consequences she couldn't imagine. But as they walked away with forced swagger and empty pockets, every vendor in that marketplace had witnessed the impossible become real, and Elena returned to her work as though she had simply discussed the weather. The following nights transformed Elena from victim into hunter, though her weapons were nothing more than a disposable camera purchased at the corner pharmacy and a notebook she kept hidden beneath her bedroom floorboards. She began arriving at the market before dawn, when darkness still cloaked the streets like a conspirator's cape, watching from the shadows as the gang members arrived in their distinctive vehicles with music pounding through tinted windows. Her arthritic fingers worked the camera with surprising steadiness, capturing license plates and faces illuminated by street lamps, each click of the shutter a small act of rebellion that fed the fire growing in her chest. The other vendors noticed her strange new schedule, but asked no questions, understanding instinctively that Elena was weaving something dangerous and necessary in the pre-dawn hours. During market days, she memorized their patterns with the precision of a seamstress, counting stitches, noting which vendors they visited first and who paid without resistance or complaint. Elena sketched their distinctive tattoos in her notebook, the elaborate numbers and symbols that decorated their arms like badges of belonging. They wore with foolish pride. She recorded their slang, their hierarchy revealed through body language and deference, building a detailed map of their organization, one observation at a time. When Miguel approached her stand, she studied him differently than the others, recognizing in his uncertain movements and averted eyes someone still teetering on the edge of the abyss rather than fully consumed by it. The gang escalated exactly as Elena had anticipated, returning on a Tuesday afternoon when the market buzzed with housewives and workers on lunch breaks. They arrived like a storm system, overturning her carefully arranged tamales and grinding them into the pavement with deliberate boot heels, while customers scattered like frightened birds. The leader spray-painted crude threats across her table in symbols meant to terrify, his crew laughing with the hollow sound of young men pretending violence comes naturally to their souls. But Elena stood motionless throughout their performance, her camera hidden in her apron pocket already, full of their crimes, her face betraying nothing but the quiet calculation of someone playing a longer game. That evening, they followed her home through dimming streets, their car crawling behind her like a predator, savoring the hunt's anticipation. Elena walked her normal route without hurrying, stopping at the corner store where she'd shopped. For 40 years, greeting neighbors by name with warmth that made her followers visible by contrast. She photographed their vehicle from her window as they sat watching her house, their cigarette embers glowing like demon eyes in the darkness. In her kitchen, she added new pages to her growing dossier, each detail another nail being carefully prepared, though the gang members celebrated outside, believing fear was finally breaking the old woman's legendary spirit. The Sunday dinner table had been sacred territory in Elena's home for 43 years, a battlefield where arguments dissolved into laughter and secrets surrendered to the warmth of shared beans and tortillas. Marco arrived, late as always, his police uniform exchanged for civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise the authority radiating from his shoulders like heat from sun-baked stones. Elena moved through her kitchen with practiced grace, serving pozole from the clay pot her mother had given her as a wedding gift, but her son noticed immediately how she favored her left side, how her sleeve concealed more than modesty required. The spoon trembled almost imperceptibly in her weathered hand as she ladled the fragrant broth, a detail that pierced Marco's trained observation like a knife finding flesh beneath armor. He caught her wrist gently as she reached across the table, his thumb brushing the purple-green bruise blooming beneath the fabric like a poisonous flower. Elena flinched before composing her face into a grandmother's reassuring smile, the same expression she'd worn when he skinned his knees as a boy, believing her invincible. "The stairs surprised me in the dark, mijo," she said with practiced lightness, pulling away to busy herself with serving rice, her voice carrying the texture of a lie told for love's protection. Marco studied her with eyes that had interrogated cartel lieutenants and corrupt politicians, seeing through her performance to the fear she hoarded like precious coins. His jaw tightened with questions he didn't ask, respecting the wall she'd built even. As every instinct screamed that his mother was sheltering storms she believed he couldn't weather. Throughout the meal, Elena deflected his concern with stories about her neighbors and questions about his work, filling the space between them with words that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. She described the market's daily dramas and recipe experiments, her hands animated despite their hidden injuries, performing normalcy with an actress's desperate conviction. Marco watched her performance knowing she'd survived revolutions and buried a husband, understanding that women like his mother carried sorrows in locked rooms they'd never let their children enter. The pozole grew cold. Between them, as unspoken truths hung heavy as smoke, both warrior hearts protecting each other across a table that suddenly felt vast as an ocean separating their separate wars. Elena returned to the marketplace the following morning with a strategy woven from instinct and survival, her bruised ribs wrapped tight beneath her embroidered blouse, like armor fashioned from wool and cotton. She positioned her tamale cart in its usual corner, where morning light painted the cobblestones gold, but her attention fixed on the youngest gang member, a boy whose eyes still held fragments of innocence beneath the tattooed teardrops marking his hollow cheeks. Miguel couldn't have been older than 17, thin as famine despite his aggressive posture, and Elena recognized the hunger in him that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with belonging. When the gang dispersed after their morning collection rounds, she called to him softly, offering a steaming tamale wrapped in corn husks that released clouds of cumin-scented steam into the cool air. His suspicion warred with desire as he approached cautiously, a stray dog expecting kicks but drawn irresistibly toward the promise of warmth and nourishment radiating from her grandmother's hands. "You remind me of my nephew," Elena lied with a truth hidden beneath layers of strategy, her voice carrying the texture of genuine affection, as Miguel accepted the tamale with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. She asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply watched him devour the food with the desperation of someone who'd forgotten what care tasted like, his tough facade crumbling with each bite. Over the following weeks, she established a ritual of feeding him, one Tamale becoming two, then conversations about his favorite foods, his childhood before the streets claimed him like a hungry river swallowing stones. Miguel began arriving earlier each day, helping her arrange her cart before his brothers in violence emerged from their nocturnal kingdoms, and Elena listened more than she spoke, her attention a gift he'd been starved for since his own mother disappeared into addiction's cruel embrace. The other vendors watched this unlikely alliance with confusion and fear, but Elena understood what they couldn't, that even young wolves were once puppies who remembered gentleness. She spoke to Miguel about choices and futures with the subtle wisdom of a woman who'd survived dictatorships and grief, never preaching but planting seeds in soil she prayed wasn't completely poisoned. His tattoos seemed less permanent in morning light as he laughed at her stories, and gradually the hardness in his eyes softened like butter left in sunlight, revealing the frightened boy beneath the manufactured monster. Elena played the longest game she'd ever known, transforming maternal instinct into a weapon more powerful than any her son commanded, love becoming the key to unlock doors that violence had sealed shut forever. Miguel arrived before dawn on the third week, his breath forming silver clouds in the December cold, and Elena knew the transformation had begun when he helped her unload supplies without being asked, his tattooed hands careful with her grandmother's clay pots as though handling sacred relics. She worked the masa while he watched, her fingers shaping corn dough into small monuments of patience, and between the rhythm of her palms she asked questions that seemed innocent as morning dew but cut straight to the architecture of his criminal world. He spoke freely now, words tumbling like confessions in a church he'd long abandoned, describing the hierarchy with its coded hand signals and territorial maps, the Thursday night meetings in the abandoned textile factory where rust bloomed on machinery like deadly flowers. Elena absorbed every detail with a memory sharpened by necessity, her mind cataloguing names and locations, while her hands never stopped their ancient dance, creating food that nourished both body and the fragile trust growing between them like a vine, reaching toward reluctant sunlight. The market awakened around them as vendors arranged pyramids of mangoes and mountains of chili peppers, their voices creating a symphony of commerce and survival that had played for generations despite whatever violence tried to silence it. Miguel revealed the operation's financial structure almost casually, explaining how money flowed upward through lieutenants to the shot caller they called El Fantasma, a man whose cruelty had become legend, whispered among those too afraid to speak his name aloud. Elena nodded with grandmother wisdom, asking about the youngest members with maternal concern that wasn't entirely performance, learning that boys as young as 12 were being recruited from schools like harvesting bitter fruit before it ripened. Her heart ached for these lost children, even as her strategic mind mapped their network with military precision, understanding that saving one boy meant destroying the machine that devoured hundreds, justice requiring sacrifice that tasted like ash and redemption mixed together. Miguel confessed his doubts during the morning's quietest hour, admitting he joined seeking family but found only fear dressed in brotherhood's clothing, his voice cracking like thin ice over deep water. Elena placed a warm tamale in his hands, her touch lingering on his scarred knuckles with the tenderness his own mother had abandoned years before, and told him that strength wasn't found in violence but in having courage to choose differently when darkness felt inevitable. He looked at her with eyes suddenly young again, vulnerability naked on his face, and she knew the information she'd gathered could dismantle the entire organization, but more importantly, she'd reached the human heart beneath the monster costume, planting hope in ground everyone assumed was permanently barren. The summons came through Miguel's phone at midnight, a message so brief it contained entire universes of threat within 3 words. Tomorrow, the woman. Proof. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the cramped apartment he shared with 5 other soldiers, staring at the screen's cold glow while his stomach twisted into configurations of nausea and terror. understanding perfectly what El Fantasma demanded as the price of acceptance into the inner circle, where real power lived. The other gang members slept around him in various states of chemical escape, their snores and mumbles filling darkness thick as concrete, but Miguel remained paralyzed between two futures, each requiring him to betray someone who'd shown him a version of himself he'd forgotten could exist. His gun rested in the drawer beside religious medals his grandmother had given him in childhood, both objects now seeming equally useless against the machinery of fate grinding toward inevitable collision, metal teeth hungry for whatever humanity he had remaining. Dawn arrived like a judge pronouncing sentence, grey light seeping through barred windows to illuminate the tattooed geography of his arms, each mark a chronicle of violence he'd committed, trying to prove worthiness to men who measured value only in blood and fear. Miguel dressed slowly, mechanical as a condemned man walking toward execution, his hands shaking as he tucked the pistol into his waistband, where it pressed against his spine like accusation made solid and unforgiving. He'd been ordered to arrive at Elena's home before she left for market, to complete the task in private where screams wouldn't summon witnesses, the clinical efficiency of the plan revealing how many times this ritual had been performed on others who'd shown defiance or weakness. The morning tasted like copper and regret, Mexico City awakening around him with indifferent beauty, merchants opening shops and mothers walking children to school, ordinary life continuing its eternal dance, while he carried death in his pocket and desperation in his heart, like competing religions demanding incompatible devotions. He walked through streets transformed into stations of his personal crucifixion, each block bringing him closer to the moment that would define everything that followed, his mind replaying every kindness Elena had offered, like evidence in a trial where he served as both defendant and judge. She'd never asked for anything except honest conversation, never demanded gratitude or obedience, simply provided space where he could remember what feeling human meant before gang life had compressed his soul into something small and vicious. Miguel thought of her hands shaping masa with patient precision, the way she'd touched his scarred knuckles without flinching, how she'd called him Mijo with maternal warmth that penetrated armor he'd spent years constructing against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Other vendors had cowered or paid or fled, but Elena had chosen a different response, treating him like someone worth saving rather than something worth veering, and that unexpected grace now felt like both gift and unbearable burden. He reached her modest house as sunrise painted walls the color of desert roses, his finger resting against the trigger, while his heart hammered arguments for and against what came next, knowing that whatever choice he made in the following moments would echo through whatever remained of his abbreviated life. Through the window, he could see Elena moving in her kitchen, preparing for another day of small dignities and quiet resistance, unaware that death stood on her doorstep wearing the face of someone she'd tried desperately to redeem. Miguel's knock came soft as prayer, 3 gentle taps that carried more weight than battering rams. And when Elena opened the door, she saw everything written across his face like scripture, composed in fear and desperate hope, the gun's outline visible beneath his shirt, but his eyes already surrendering to truths he couldn't speak aloud. She stepped aside without hesitation, gesturing him into her kitchen where morning light transformed ordinary objects into witnesses of what would unfold, the wooden table, scarred by decades of family meals, becoming an altar where confessions and revelations would determine whether redemption remained possible for either of them. Miguel stood frozen in her doorway, caught between the violent world that had shaped him and this fragile sanctuary that smelled of cinnamon and forgiveness, his hand hovering near the weapon while his resolve crumbled like dry earth beneath unexpected rain. Elena moved to her stove with deliberate calm, pouring coffee into 2 cups painted with fading flowers, her movements speaking a language older than gang codes or criminal hierarchies. The universal grammar of mothers who see through deception straight into wounded souls. She placed one cup before him and kept the other cradled in her weathered hands, steam rising between them like incense offered to gods of mercy and impossible choices, waiting for him to find whatever words existed for this moment. Miguel's voice emerged, broken as shattered glass, admitting they'd sent him to kill her, that his acceptance into the inner circle required her blood. And Elena listened without flinching, nodding as though he'd simply reported unfortunate weather rather than announced her scheduled execution. She reached across the table to cover his trembling hands with hers, touch, conveying what speeches never could, that she'd known this reckoning approached like storm clouds gathering on distant horizons, and had prepared accordingly. Elena rose with quiet dignity, walking to a shelf where family photographs stood arranged like evidence of lives built through love and sacrifice, rather than violence and fear, selecting one frame that held her truth like a grenade with the pin already pulled. She placed the photograph before Miguel, showing herself flanked by a man in formal police uniform, adorned with medals and insignia of ultimate authority, their arms wrapped around each other with familial affection that couldn't be manufactured or mistaken. Her son's face, carrying the same determined features Miguel had seen in her own expressions of stubborn resistance. The revelation landed like earthquake beneath Miguel's understanding of reality, fault lines splitting apart everything he'd assumed about this woman, who treated him with incomprehensible kindness despite knowing exactly what darkness he represented and served. Elena explained in measured tones that her son Marco commanded the entire Metropolitan Police Force, that she'd been gathering evidence since the first extortion attempt, and that Miguel now stood at a crossroads where one path led to prison or death, while the other offered something he'd stopped believing existed in his world. She painted no false pictures of easy redemption, acknowledging the wire he'd have to wear and testimony he'd need to provide, the danger of betraying an organization that punished disloyalty with theatrical cruelty, but also offering witness protection, education, and the possibility of becoming someone his future children might admire, rather than fear. Miguel wept then, not the silent tears of men afraid to show weakness, but the profound sobbing of someone feeling chains break after forgetting freedom's weight. And Eleanor held him as she'd held her own son through childhood nightmares, whispering that courage meant choosing difficulty over destruction. Dawn continued spreading. Across the city outside, ordinary and beautiful, while inside that modest kitchen, two people rewrote destinies that had seemed carved in stone and blood. Miguel's wire pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat, the recording device smaller than a prayer card, but heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried, transmitting every whispered confession into police vans, positioned 3 blocks away, where Elena sat beside her son, coordinating the operation through headphones and hand signals. The gang's warehouse meeting began at dawn as always. Leadership gathered around tables cluttered with cash bundles and product shipments, their voices casual as they discussed murders and territory expansion like merchants reviewing quarterly profits, unknowing that their words flowed directly into digital recorders that would seal their fates in courtrooms governed by laws they'd always considered irrelevant. Miguel forced himself to breathe naturally, while his former brothers detailed execution orders and drug routes with the relaxed confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. Each sentence, another nail in coffins they didn't realize they were building. Elena listened through static-laced transmission with the focused intensity of generals awaiting perfect strike moments, her weathered hands gripping notes she'd compiled over months of patient documentation. Photographs and license plates and witness accounts, transforming scattered observations into comprehensive prosecutorial ammunition. The warehouse conversation reached its crescendo when the leader bragged about murdering a rival family, including their children, describing details that made even hardened detectives grimace, and Elena gave the signal her son had been waiting for, with raised fist cutting through morning darkness. The raid exploded across 6 simultaneous locations with precision that only months of intelligence gathering could produce, battering rams, shattering doors, while flash grenades turned criminal sanctuaries into chaos and blinding confusion. Officers shouting commands in English and Spanish, while gang members scrambled for weapons they'd never reach. Elena remained in the command van, watching video feeds from helmet cameras. Seeing her courage manifested through tactical teams executing warrants she'd essentially written through her dangerous documentation, each arrest validating every risk she'd taken. Miguel stayed motionless during the warehouse invasion, hands raised and identity pre-confirmed, extracted by officers who whisked him toward protection while his former family faced walls with zip ties cutting into wrists that would never again threaten innocent vendors. The operation concluded in 17 minutes of controlled violence. 32 arrests, including every member of leadership hierarchy, seizures of weapons and narcotics sufficient to guarantee decades of imprisonment, the gang's reign ending not through superior brutality, but through one grandmother's refusal to accept intimidation as inevitable. Marco embraced his mother as sunrise painted the city in redemptive gold, both understanding without speaking that her quiet war had achieved what aggressive policing never could, infiltrating through maternal wisdom where badges and guns found only closed doors and hostile silence. Elena had wielded kindness as strategic weapon and dignity as armor, proving that humble people facing extraordinary darkness need not surrender their humanity to survive or triumph. The market vendors would return to stalls, no longer shadowed by extortion, their safety purchased not through violence, but through one woman's recognition that even lost boys contained salvageable souls if someone dared to reach them. Elena requested only that she be allowed to visit Miguel once, before he disappeared into protection, wanting to ensure he understood that redemption's path stretched long and difficult ahead, but that she believed absolutely in his capacity to walk it with honor restored and conscience cleared. 6 months dissolved like morning mist over the market, where Elena arranged tamales with the same careful precision she'd once used documenting gang members, her hands moving through routines that carried weight of both tradition and triumph earned through courage most would never comprehend. The envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked between produce deliveries, Miguel's handwriting uncertain but determined across paper that had traveled through witness. Protection channels designed to sever all traceable connections. Elena opened it slowly beside her steaming pots, while vendors bustled around her restored sanctuary, the letter's first word stealing her breath with unexpected tenderness that confirmed everything she'd risked had generated harvest beyond justice alone. He called her Mama in that opening line, the word carrying significance that transcended biology and entered territory where souls recognize kindred spirits across chasms of circumstance and bloodline. Miguel wrote of college classes that challenged him, and nightmares that still visited but diminished gradually, of therapy sessions where he spoke her name as the turning point between destruction and possibility, his gratitude flowing through sentences that trembled with emotion no criminal past could fully extinguish. Elena traced his words with fingertips that had kneaded masa for decades, and offered redemption to boys everyone else had abandoned, tears sliding down weathered cheeks while market sounds created symphony of normalcy her bravery had restored. Marco found his mother that evening, still holding Miguel's letter like sacred text, understanding without explanation that some victories manifest not through headlines or commendations, but through transformed lives that ripple outward through generations, yet unborn. He'd framed the department. Citation they'd given her despite her protests, but both knew the real memorial existed in markets operating without fear and young men choosing education over violence. Elena requested only that Marco ensure Miguel knew she prayed for him nightly, that her door remained spiritually open even if physical reunion proved impossible, that maternal, Love once offered never expired, regardless of distance or circumstance. They stood together in her modest kitchen, where this entire operation had essentially begun with bruises she'd tried concealing. The space transformed from crime scene into testament that ordinary people wielding extraordinary courage could bend reality toward justice when institutions alone proved insufficient. Elena returned to her market stand each dawn, not as victim who'd survived, but as warrior who'd conquered through weapons no gang could comprehend or counter, her tamales carrying flavor of dignity that refused surrender. The letter joined her family photos in frames that told stories of survival and transformation, Miguel's words becoming scripture for what humble strength achieves when fear loses its paralyzing grip. Eleanor's legacy would outlive her in vendor stalls operating freely and boys choosing different paths because one grandmother proved that maternal love deployed strategically could dismantle evil that bullets only scattered. She remained exactly who she'd always been, simple woman selling food and extending kindness. But now the market understood that simplicity often masks profundity that changes worlds, one courageous choice at each deliberate moment. Her story would pass through whispered conversations and family warnings that underestimating quiet people proves foolish. Because dignity forged through hardship creates steel that no violence can ultimately break. What would you do if someone threatened your family? Subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.